Last year, an estimated 64,000 people died from overdosing on drugs in America. That's more American deaths than the entire Vietnam War. About 80% of those deaths came from natural or synthetic opioids, a class of drugs that includes legal prescription painkillers such as Oxycontin and Vicodin, as well as morphine and heroin. Today, 91 people die from an opioid overdose every single day in America, and addiction rates have skyrocketed by 493% over the course of the last 6 years. But this epidemic didn't just occur out of nowhere. So today we'll be taking a look at the primary culprits behind one of the biggest public health crises in American history. I'm joined now by Mike Papantonio, a founding partner of the firm Levin Papantonio, which is representing 4 Ohio counties that are fighting several pharmaceutical companies for their role in manufacturing the crisis. Mike, thank you so much for joining me. So let's start from the beginning. How did drug companies like Purdue and Janssen plant the seeds for the epidemic we see today?
The first thing they did is they went out and hired Biostitutes all over the country. And Biostitutes is a legal term, and we use it in the industry to talk about the scientists and the doctors who sometimes work for university, maybe Yale, Princeton, Harvard. And they go to these doctors and they convince them that they should write phonied up literature for the company. And the literature should reflect whatever the wishes of the company is. These people are out telling doctors that, we've looked at all this and the product is perfect, or you don't have to worry about long-term use of the product. It's okay. And their clinicals showed just the opposite. Their clinicals showed that a person could become addicted to an opioid within about 7 days. And so they had to start off with a big lie. And to get the big lie, they had to get into the literature, medical literature, where a doctor that maybe is coming out of medical school looks at the literature and he says, oh wow, this is revolutionary. We have a drug that'll make pain go away and we don't have to worry about addiction. So that's where it started. And Purdue knew that was a completely, just an utter lie. But they also, you see, we talk about Purdue a lot, but we don't talk about the distributors who were the real drug pushers. McKesson and Cardinal and Amerisource, they all did the same thing. They kept the lie alive where it came to treating doctors.
What types of communities and markets were being targeted by these companies?
They would typically go to areas where there's despair. They had done their homework and they figured out that if somebody is out of a job or somebody is moved from the middle class to they can barely stay alive, that there's despair that follows that. They would start off in mining areas like West Virginia, industrial areas where jobs have been lost, Detroit, where jobs have been sent out of the country, and there was just a wholesale despair. So they started there, and they understood, we're going to look at where the pharmacies are, what are the big number of pharmacies, because that tells us a lot about the population, doesn't it? Where there's despair, there are physical issues. And so we can look at the number of hospitals, we can look at the number of pharmacies, and we can begin there. And we can start understanding that that's where we want to set up our shop. That's where we want to send most of our distributors. And if you look on a map all the way across the United States, every one of the areas they hit was just like that. And interestingly enough, they were looking for a Caucasian population that was going through a despair maybe that they had not experienced for decades. And all of a sudden, it's a whole new program.
Talk about West Virginia, because I think that a lot of people know West Virginia as kind of this pinnacle of the epidemic, right? The ground zero.
Yeah, I mean, West Virginia, you'd have areas where there would be a population of 3 million people, and the company, we would find out through the number of sales that they would sell 700 million opioids in that community. Yeah, startling numbers, but that was exactly how it worked. At one point, what ended up happening, Abby, is that people believe, we want to believe that corporate America wants to do the right thing, and we sometimes forget that they're really not a person, that their sole purpose in life is to make more money. And so we want to believe that there's some human behind there that certainly wouldn't let these horrible things happen, but that just is not the case. And so if we look at this case in particular, at every turn, there was an effort by corporate America to actually buy in to the addiction issue. Here's what I mean. When a company is selling that many pills, right? And we have, let's take McKesson. let's say McKesson or Amerisource, they have 3 or 4 salesmen that live on 3rd Street in Huntington, West Virginia. And then over on 18th Street, there's a pill mill, right? The pill mill's been in business for months. Well, Mary or Bob, who work for McKesson, have to drive by that pill mill every day. They see people lined up at the pill mill. They see them lined up around the pill mill and down the street from the pill mill. They have direct notice that something's not right because under their statute, under the 1970 statute, they have a duty to report anything that looks suspicious. That's pretty suspicious. The second thing that happens is Mary and Bob, who work for these distributors, they also see the nightly news. And they see hospitals talking about, we can't keep up with the addiction problem. Or we don't have enough ways to, EMTs, we're seeing people, 5, 6 a day that are dying from a drug overdose. They see that, that's tangible to them. They don't have to guess. They live there. And so at some point, you have the companies saying, gee whiz, we didn't know. How could we have known this was going to happen? Well, let's give them year 1 and year 2. Let's give them that. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, which there's no reason to do that, but let's do it anyway. Let's give them the reason of doubt for year 1 and 2. What about year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10? What they actually did, Abby, is they made this addiction issue part of their business plan. They internalized what was happening out there in the street to become part of their business. And so all of a sudden, you've got pills being sold out on the street for $5 to $8 a pill. Somebody's got to buy them somewhere. It's coming from the companies, and they knew that. Look, it defies logic, don't you see? It defies total logic to see something go from a company that's selling $150 million worth of products to where an industry is making $500 million just in a short period of time. And they're saying, wow, that's a pretty good year. And then they're making $8 billion. And then the industry is collectively doing $100 billion. And then they're doing 200 and 300 billion. What's changed? I mean, really, it's just a logical question. What has changed?
The addiction rate.
The addiction rate. And how has that happened? Because they put the product out there.
Unbelievable.
Knowingly. Yeah.
And then it's so normalized, it only really makes the news when you have, someone like Philip Seymour Hoffman dying from a fentanyl-laced heroin dose.
Yeah, and the heroin, since you raised that, the heroin you see is really what we call the tail of the problem. Because what would happen, a pill mill would be crushed. Enforcement would finally be able to close down that pill mill. So availability of opioids was a big problem. In comes black tar heroin. And the drug user who used to be using OxyContin now has moved to heroin. And the industry knew that too. The industry understood we can't just addict 100,000 people in this area of the state and then leave town without knowing there's some repercussions. Understand, an opioid addict, it's not just that they want another high. It is that their body hurts. They're nauseous. They can't function. Sometimes they can't walk. They lose, as far as losing their eyesight sometimes, because they're in withdrawals from the opiate. So in comes black tar heroin. They don't buy it because they want the high. They buy it because their physical pain is so incredible that it's just like you waking up with the worst, flu times 1,000 every day.
There's many unique phenomenons to American society. I think the crisis of healthcare or lack thereof is obviously one of them. This is also, I feel like, a unique phenomenon in terms of the numbers, the sheer numbers of people dying from the opioid epidemic. Why is the U.S. So specifically impacted by this? 95,
to follow up on that very issue, 95% of all the Suboxones sold in the world are sold in the United States. They actually started telling hospitals and doctors, it's just not fair. What you're doing to these poor people, making them suffer, it just isn't fair. And actually the hospital industry got involved because they were told these same lies. So the hospital, matter of fact, the HHS, which is the biggest hospital organization in the country, sent out letters to doctors in around 2005, 2006 saying, we don't think you're selling enough opioids. We're not, and the poor patient, because of that, we're suffering. It became a narrative that was created by the industry. They tried to make it sound like, oh, the poor patient, we got to worry about the poor patient. And so it sounds plausible, doesn't it? But behind there, what they were saying is, we really hope that patient buys a lot of drugs. They really didn't care about, the suffering of the patient from pain. It was all about how to sell more drugs.
Isn't there a part of willful ignorance, though, on behalf of the medical field and the hospitals and the doctors? I mean,
I guess some of it's willful. For example, if you have a pill mill, that's not willful ignorance, that's intent. Where you have a doctor that says, wow, I'm making a lot of money selling these drugs. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, you go by his office and there's a circle all the way out to the street, people standing in their pajamas with their children, lined up for blocks, waiting to get into the pill mill. That's the level that it reached in the extreme.
When did the science become clear? Because of course, big pharma, we know their profit, mechanism, but the doctors, they need the doctors to prescribe these, and according to the CDC, over 99% are over-prescribing opioids.
Yeah, the story about opioids, opium, has always been clear. As a matter of fact, the opium wars that took place in China, if you go back and look to that historical basis, that wasn't, it wasn't trade companies like tea trade companies that started the opium war. It was London and the big countries all over France, big countries all over the world that wanted to take a product, opium, and sell it in China. China does not grow opium. And during that period of time, it became very apparent how dangerous opium was. And there's no difference between the opium that they found was so dangerous, 17s, 18s, there was no difference. And it became so bad in China that the emperor in China said, my gosh, we're losing control of our culture. And he actually started having public executions. So what ended up happening is you had a lot of Chinese migrate to California. And when they got to California, what did they do? They started opening their opium dens. And so those laws developed that where doctors, that the only people that could prescribe it would be doctors under really extreme limitations, even back during the time of opium dens in California. So there's so much history about how dangerous opium is. There was no new discovery. These people understood that they had a cash cow, and they knew about the value of the cash cow just by reading a history book.
And let's talk about that value. How much money is there to be made in this industry?
Well, the first year that Purdue came out with OxyContin, I think they made $150 million. But by year number 3, they were making $6, $7, $8 billion. And it wasn't just them making the money, it was the distributors too. See, we want to give the distributors a pass. We want to focus on Purdue and say, gee, Purdue is they're the bad guy. They're awful. They're awful. But what about the people who said, you have to have the drug pushers too? And the drug pushers were McKesson and Amerisource and Cardinal and many other distributors, but those 3 companies were able to gain 85% of the market. They took control of 85% of the market. They did that by way of legislation that we passed, that was the Substance Abuse Act in 1970. They were supposed to be the gatekeepers, you see.
But now today, obviously Big Pharma's not doing anything about it because it's their profit-making measure, but what about doctors and hospitals? Are they doing anything?
They are, yeah. You have doctors and hospitals that are now reacting, but they can't react fast enough. You see, the industry wants to blame it on law enforcement and doctors and just no good people that don't have any self-control. Let it be their child who gets hooked on OxyContin. Let them watch what happens. And you start, and then the realism hits in. You've killed a person. They're killing people. It's no different than murder. Why won't we call it murder? Why won't we do that when we have a kid that maybe was a all-star kind of kid in high school, and all of a sudden they break a leg or some type of injury, and they go to the doctor, and the next thing you know, they're hooked on these opioids, and they're literally, it's killing them, and they end up dying 3 years later from an overdose. Mm-hmm. Very common story.
Absolutely. I feel like we all know someone who's either suffering or has suffered from an opioid addiction. Let's talk about the political response to this crisis. 2 months into office, Trump created a panel to recommend solutions to the epidemic, but then of course he hires Congressman Tom Marino, first of all, and then I just read news today that the health secretary appointee is a literal executive from Big Pharma.
Yeah, the health executive that Trump wanted was not only an executive, but he actually was with McKesson and wrote the legislation that said to the Department of the DEA that you need to back off on enforcement. Wrote the legislation. You're overkilling the enforcement. We can't do this because, and their argument was the poor pitiful patient. You see, that's the same argument all this started with. The poor pitiful patient, they can't get what they need in the way of pain control. So Department of Justice and DEA, you really need to back off. Everybody with the DEA knew that was absurd. Everybody in the Department of Justice knew how ridiculous that was. But you had Congress that passed it and Obama that signed the legislation. And Eric Holder, who comes from Covington Burling, he's a white shoe lawyer. He's never represented anybody that's been hurt. He represents corporations. He can speak their language. So he gets behind all that. And so all of a sudden you have a political agenda that's driven primarily by how much money did you give your congressman today? How much money did you give your senator? You know, there's a scramble in Congress right now. Everybody's looking for cover because they understand what they created. They helped create. When they told the DEA that you really got to stand back, that you shouldn't do these enforcement actions, when they did that, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were getting 50,000 from this person, 100,000 from that person. And so what we're involved with right now is that's going to be actually part of our case in trial. We're going to be actually able to talk about that. When the defendant stands up and says, oh, well, gee, this is the DEA's fault. Really? This is the doctor's fault. Well, we're going to tell the backstories. And those backstories are going to cause a lot of jitters within the industry.
Let's talk about the legal actions that your firm is taking against the industry.
Yeah, these counties and these cities are the people who've lost all the money. They're the ones that had to increase EMTs and do special training for EMTs. They had to buy all the Narcan, which is a drug that can save people's lives if they go in an overdose. They had to expand their dependency courts where children were being taken away from their parents because of the addiction problem. They had to be involved with figuring out how a jail was now going to become a rehab center for some of these drug folks. The cost in a typical community was anywhere between $90 to $200 million. That's just the beginning number. The tail of it, where people are now addicted and they're suffering from everything from hepatitis C to HIV to all types of physical ailments related to the black tar heroin or the heroin, those numbers are staggering. So what we're doing is we're bringing cases on behalf of each one of those entities. And I want to try the cases. I mean, I don't have any intention of sitting down trying to settle. You had the attorney generals, for example, that settled. I mean, I think all of them settled against Purdue for nothing. I mean, what was it, $50 million, $100 million? They made that much while we've been sitting here talking. Yeah, because they wanted to go to the constituents and say they did something, but it wasn't anything. It didn't amount to anything. And so it's my hope to get them to court. You know, that's my MO. You know, I think people have seen it before. Take it to trial. DuPont was the last time I've ended that project and now moved on to another one. And so this is the project that I think is most important. People ask me all the time, well, is this as big as tobacco? I say this is much bigger than tobacco. This targeted our children. Here, you have these same CEOs in the shadows that are still paying out money. It's still taking place as we speak. The money is exchanging hands. They've made their, let's say they made $200 billion. So if they pay out $100 billion to get out of this, which isn't enough, they still have made a good profit. What's happened in the past is Big Pharma has operated without any oversight or regulations. We want to think they did because we came up with the Substance Act of 1970. We say, wow, that's pretty strong. But what good is the Substance Act? There's no regulatory that can help if you can't go arrest them, you see. You can fine them. When they pay a fine, you understand, they pay a fine. Taxpayers end up paying the fine. Every one of those companies, McKesson, Cardinal, and Amerisource, they've all paid hundreds of millions in fines. But it doesn't mean anything. It's simply cost of doing business. And then the taxpayers end up footing that bill because the company writes those fines off. So we lose tax dollars because they pay $100 million, but then they end up writing it off, so it doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, they wear Armani suits and they have Rolex watches and they drive Bentleys around and they come from great schools. They live in the Hamptons. And so we don't look at them like criminals, so we don't put them in prison. My goal in what I'm doing nationally is I want to get all of these cities and their states, I want to get their money back for them. But I really want to make sure some people go to prison.